Hi guys, welcome to the Sodcast. I am Wendy Sod, your host. Today's case I have for you is a really cool one. It is going to be called A Death in a Love Story. So I'm going to start by saying that from my other videos, if you guys have watched them, you know I'm from a really small town, right? So when you're from a small town, it seems to be a commonality that every small town has their town weirdo, right? You know what I'm talking about, you guys. I know you do. Don't call me mean. It's just a fact. There's always that one person that people are kind of whispering about. They're making assumptions about this person. Maybe they just are a quiet person. They don't socialize as much as other people. That one person that dresses a little different, they're a little eccentric, right? You know who I'm talking about. It reminds me of Mr. Myrtle from The Sandlot, you guys. Okay, they hit the ball over the fence where Mr. Myrtle lives, and they're like, "You hit it, you get it." Yeah. They don't want to go over that damn fence because crazy Mr. Myrtle is living over there, who's just this little innocent blind guy, right? Living over there with his big old dog and never hurt a fly. And they're absolutely terrified of this guy. Like if they cross over that fence, he's going to pull out a butcher knife and he's going to whack off their heads. He's going to throw it in a pot on the stove and slowly cook it and eat it for dinner. I mean, come on. That's real shit when you're a kid, right? So, Ringgold, Georgia, a very small, close-knit town, also has their town eccentric guy, right? And his name is Alvin Ridley. He was known as Crazy Alvin in town. And people would describe him as kind of antisocial. He kept to himself. He always looked kind of disheveled. His clothes didn't match. Just always came off as very distrusting of other people. He was very distrusting of the police department. Always claimed that they were out to get him. So he just was one of these very bizarre people. And people were somewhat afraid of him for whatever reason. And, he just kept to himself. He did his thing. He was living in a small house in Ringgold with his two parents. And his two parents ended up passing away, so he lived there alone. And at the time, he started up a TV repair shop in town where he would work on TVs. And everybody brought their TVs to Alvin because he knew his shit about TVs. I mean, that's a fact. He might have been a weirdo, but he knew his shit about TVs. He could fix any of them. So, kids would go by his shop and holler at him and, make little shitty comments to him and stuff, just being kind of mean to Alvin. And, I think that he kind of just blew this off. Like he was just living his life and stuff like that just didn't get to Alvin. So as time goes on, Alvin's TV repair shop begins to fail. And he's looking for other avenues, and he decides to join the army. And he does this, and he's gone for a while, and one time he comes home on leave. And he ends up having a date with a young lady by the name of Virginia. Now, Virginia was known to be, she was described as an outcast and really debilitatingly shy. Like she couldn't make friends, just very, very shy around other people, but not with Alvin. Alvin said she would talk his head off till well after midnight that night, you guys. And it was like a match made in heaven, these two. Like when they met, they completed each other. And all they needed was each other. So, Virginia would bring home Alvin to her parents and introduce him. And initially, the family would say that they really liked Alvin and thought that he was going to be a good match for her and take care of her. And you see, growing up, Virginia suffered from severe epilepsy. And so she heavily relied on her medication that she took. So as time went on, they would say that he seemed to become kind of possessive with her and just a little bit controlling in their opinion. And Virginia and Alvin ended up marrying in 1966, and they moved away from Virginia's family back into Alvin's childhood home in Ringgold. And so when they get there, Virginia never works out of the home. She is kind of a homebody. She doesn't, he goes off to church on Sundays. He said he couldn't even get her to go to church with him or to the grocery store with him. She just stayed at home, and she was happy doing this. She was happy being a homemaker, he said. She loved to cook. She spent a ton of time in the kitchen. She loved to write. She loved to do the cleaning, and he said she was great at it. That was just her thing. And she took very good care of her husband. And they just seemed to be really happy just having each other. And it seemed like they didn't need anybody else. And he wasn't going to force her to leave the house, And he said that as time went on, in the 1980s, Virginia made the decision on her own that, I'm tired of taking this seizure medicine. It doesn't seem to be curing me. And that I'm going to just hand this over to God and put it in his hands. And either God will cure me or he'll take me. And so she did. She stopped her medication. And he said that her seizures would get very bad at times, and then there'd be long periods of times where she was doing really good and she wouldn't have them. But this also played into the reason why she didn't want to go into public, because she was embarrassed and she felt ashamed when she would have these episodes in public. So she chose to stay at home. So moving along here, on October 4th of 1996, the 911 dispatch would receive a phone call from Alvin. And I am going to play that for you here. And
I thank my wife, but is she breathing? I don't think so. Does she have any medical problems or anything? Oh, she's an athletic. Okay, but you don't think she's breathing? I don't think so. Please hurry.
Okay, so there it is. You can hear for yourself. The 911 operator was a little caught off guard because of what he was reporting and how he was expressing himself, or lack thereof. He sounded emotionless. He did not sound panicked. Just didn't sound quite right. So EMS would be dispatched to the home. And they would say when they arrive at the home, they're met by this big restrictive fence around this property, and, a beware of the dog sign over here and a no trespassing sign over here. And they just said, it was not very inviting. You just got the feeling that you weren't wanted there. And let's just say there wasn't no spring wreath hanging on the front door, guys. So they go into the home, and they will report that Mr. Ridley would go, his behavior was kind of sporadic. He would sit there calm and quiet and not say anything, and then all of a sudden jump up, and he'd be frantic, and he'd be running around doing stuff and saying stuff, and just very odd. So he says that morning he woke up and he found his wife face down, not breathing. Now, he says that she hadn't had any seizures in quite some time, But that night, she had had one of the most violent, severe seizures that he had seen her have in 30 years they were together. And, you know, it scared him a little bit, but he had seen him before, so it wasn't, you know, she went back to sleep. And then he wakes up in the morning, you know, around 6:30, and that's when he finds her. So he said she was face down. He shook her, shook her, shook her. She wouldn't wake up. She wouldn't respond. She was cold to the touch. He said he rolls her over and he tried to do some CPR. And he right away realized that, you know, it's just too late. You know, I don't know how long she's been gone. So they take Mr. Ridley down to the police station to further question him. And as that is happening, the county coroner heads to Mr. Ridley's house. Now, this coroner had been recently appointed to the position, but she was a local and she had lived in the town for years and years and years and knew of Alvin and, you know, always thought that he lived there in this home alone because she said, I've seen him out in public hundreds of times. Never once did I see him out in public with anyone, a woman or otherwise. So when she goes into the house, she finds 49-year-old Virginia Ridley lying in the bed, and what she notices about her is that she has petechial hemorrhage in and around her eyes. Now, her first thought on this, and her only thought on this, was that it was strangulation or suffocation. That's how you get those spots around your eyes or in your eyes, the broken blood vessels. So they go back and they're, you know, presenting him with this information, and he's, you know, I didn't hurt my wife. I never would hurt my wife. I did nothing from the day I married her. I cared for her and I took care of her and she took care of me. Why would I hurt my wife? So, as it turns out, he is charged with the murder of his wife, Virginia, in 1998. He is thrown behind bars, and so Alvin realizes, I better start looking for a lawyer. So he starts calling around to some local lawyers, right? And he comes upon this guy by the name of McCracken Poston. And so Mr. Poston goes to the jail to meet with him, and you know, he immediately recognizes who he is because he had also grown up in the town. And he says, I knew who he was for the past 20 years. And he himself said, I always knew that he was, you know, crazy Alvin and that he was the odd character in town. So he listens to his story and he's thinking, you know, okay, I'm going to take this case on. He said, because you could see the love in his eyes that he had for his wife. So he tries to learn as much as he can about Alvin and his life with Virginia. And he tries to get to the bottom of why people are saying that this wife came out of nowhere. And so he, I guess the coroner had reached out to some of Virginia's family, and they wanted a family member to come identify her body. And the family would say that we don't think we can do that. We haven't seen her in 30 years, that, you know, we don't think we'd recognize her. And they begin to tell a story that over the years, the couple slowly distanced themselves from Virginia's family. And they would go as far to as take Alvin to court at one point during his marriage to Virginia, and ordered the judge, the judge ordered Alvin to produce his wife in court so they could see her in the flesh and blood and know that she was alive. And so she shows up in court that day, and Miss Virginia walks in and she says, I'm here. I'm fine. I'm with my husband. I'm where I want to be. Leave me the fuck alone. Bye. Like, she just wants to be left alone. So that's the end of that. So getting back to this lawyer trying to find out who Alvin really is and who his wife was, he wants to go into Alvin's home. And Alvin initially, absolutely not. You're not going in there. Finally, Mr. Poston convinces him, I have to go into your house and try to find some kind of evidence to prove that you weren't keeping her locked to a bed with handcuffs and naked and all these horrible things that the people in the community are saying, that, you know, he kept his wife hostage for 30 years and all these things. He said, I need proof that that didn't happen. Let me in your house. So finally, Alvin agrees. He says, go ahead, go in the house. So Mr. Poston gets to the house, and he too is struck by a very strong scent that he would describe maybe as cat urine. Says that the house was very musty smelling. He said it was middle of the summer. He said the windows were all shut. There was no air conditioning. He said it was just putrid. But looking beyond all that, he starts looking around this house, right? And he's trying to figure out, what can I find to prove that Miss Virginia was here willingly and that she was happy and didn't have, you know, any claims of abuse by him. So as he's looking around, he starts to notice that the walls are covered with something, but it's not wallpaper. But he says there is not a blank spot on the walls where there isn't a piece of paper from Virginia's notebook. Now, she was a writer, and for years and years and years, Miss Virginia would journal her day-to-day life. And when she was done with that day's journal, she would tape it to the wall. And, you know, for doing this for so many years, he said every single wall in this house was covered like wallpaper with her writings. And he says, cha-ching, here is our evidence. He starts reading these letters, right? And they're talking about how much she loves her husband and how wonderful he is and what they had for dinner that evening, and talking about, you know, why she decided to stay in the house and never leave. And she talks several times about why she made the decision to stop taking her seizure medicine. And, you know, not one bad word about her husband, Alvin. And so the lawyer is ecstatic. He said, here it is. Here's our proof that she was a happy wife. So they go to trial, okay? And the prosecution is, you know, stuck on this theory that the petechial hemorrhage is from suffocation. And they're not looking at anything else. No other cause for this death. Although Virginia had no other injuries on her body, like you might see from strangulation or, you know, bruising on the back of the neck if he was pushing her head down into it. There was none of that. None of it, okay? Just these hemorrhages in her eyes. So on the stand, the medical examiner gets up there and he is sticking to his dang story. This is homicide, and Alvin killed her by suffocating her. So the lawyer is pushing him, and he said, but, you know, that's not the only way that petechial hemorrhage can happen, is it? And the medical examiner, he is fighting it tooth and nail, and he says, this is what happened. This is what happened. He killed his wife. So the Mr. Poston, the lawyer, keeps pushing, and he says, but can't that happen, sir, also in a death by seizures? When someone dies from seizures, they can also have these hemorrhages in the eyes. And he presents another case that was in recent years that was the same exact situation. And she too had these hemorrhages in her eyes. So Mr. Poston, after a day's worth of grilling this guy on the stand, finally gets him to admit, you guys, that it is possible that the petechial hemorrhage came from seizures instead of, strangulation being the only cause. So at that point, it was like his lawyer's thinking, game over, and the jurors are just like, what? After all of this time, he's saying there's no other way. So at some point, they take a recess, and Mr. Poston was totally against having Alvin testify because of, him being so odd. He was kind of afraid to put him on the stand, like, oh God, what's this guy going to say? So that day, they go to recess, and typically they took lunch together. But on that day, Mr. Poston says, you know what, Alvin, I'm kind of tired of having lunch with you. And I know you're kind of tired of having lunch with me. Why don't you go, with some of your church buddies and have lunch with them? So that's what Alvin does that day. And he leaves. He comes back into the courtroom, and he's witnessed sitting there whispering with his lawyer, right? And all of a sudden, Mr. Poston calls Alvin to the stand. So Alvin says that when he was at lunch talking with his buddies, that God spoke to him and said, you know what, you better get up on that stand and tell your side of the story. So Mr. Poston's terrified, but he says, who am I to argue with the words of God? And, let's just let Alvin do this and pray that it turns out. Well, it does turn out. Alvin does exceptionally well on the stand. Like, he does really good. And people could see, the jurors could see how much he loved his wife. And so court adjourns that day, and the jurors start to go over the evidence, and it only takes them 2 hours and 15 minutes to return to the courtroom with their verdict. And their verdict for Mr. Alvin was not guilty. And everybody was just ecstatic. It's like the first time you see any kind of reaction out of Alvin. He's smiling, he's happy, it was exciting time. And the lawyer will make the comment that, he knew he had it in the bag at that point. But, so, that is all for the case that I have for you guys. And, I just love this story. It usually turns out that, the husband did it, and I just love this story. I think it's so sweet, and I just love the fact that all they needed was each other. So that concludes the case for today, you guys, and I hope you will join me on my next video. Bye.